Korea saw a host of cultural events this past weekend, with this year's BTS Festa at Yeouido Hangang Park attracting some 400,000 fans according to local media, and the annual Queer Parade in Daegu making quite a bit of headlines here and beyond. So what was the occasion behind the crowds of global BTS fans in Yeouido? And why did the LGBTQ festival in Daegu dominate headlines? Also, how is Korea leveraging its soft power at the BIE in Paris this week? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. It's that time of the week yet again when we touch upon diverse stories here that made headlines elsewhere as well. For more on this, I have Sebastien Falletti here in the studio with me. Sebastien, welcome back.
Good afternoon.
I also have Jack Barton with us. Jack, it's good to have you here.
It's great to be back.
Right, Sebastien, let's begin with a number of events that took place here in Korea this past weekend. First of all, thousands of BTS fans gathered at the Yeouido Hangang River Park on Saturday to mark the birthday of BTS. Could you tell us a bit about the activities that took place there?
Well, basically it was not exactly a concert, it was more like something that would look like a farewell to BTS, in the sense that most of the members of the band are going to military service. So there's going to be a pause or a hiatus, and only a few members were on stage, and there were 5,000 happy few fans from all over the world, the so-called army, who had the chance to see them directly. But there's many more, talking about hundreds of thousands of people around Hangang. Having said that, there was also a lot of people just having picnic there. So maybe they were not exactly all fans of BTS, but at least what's interesting about this event is that you can see that this band, I mean, actually BTS is facing a crucial juncture, because usually when you're a K-pop band and you reach that age, in your mid-20s, late 20s, you vanish. It's the end of your career. So BTS is sending a signal that they said they might want to continue after military service, that they're projecting themselves for a longer-term career. So this event was also a way to, of course, thanks their audience on this birthday anniversary, but it's also a signal that, hey, we are still around and we want to be there for the long run. So stick with us, and that was the key message. And also, what's interesting to see on that crowd, there was a lot of foreign fans, a lot of young fans, well, not so young, but a lot of foreign fans were there. Some flew to Korea just for this event. So BTS kind of symbolized the attraction of some global audience. Maybe BTS is certainly more popular abroad than in Korea itself, in a way. So it's also an interesting twist that we saw there, I think.
Right, indeed. Well, according to local media, as I mentioned earlier, Jack, some 400,000 BTS fans apparently gathered at the Yeouido Hangang River Park on Saturday. It appears that the group's hiatus has been having little impact on its popularity. I mean, despite concerns earlier on that the economic repercussions of BTS's hiatus would be quite severe. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the initial economic implications were big. I think the share price of the company took a $1.7 billion hit. The fans, of course, were all extremely worried that after 9 years of being arguably the world's most famous boy band, the hiatus, could it mean a breakup? Could it mean we'd never see BTS tour again? You know, a lot of concern there amongst the BTS army. And so to have them come back and play is one. It's huge for those fans who thought we're not going to get to see them for another few years. They're also wondering, might this be the last show, even though there's a sort of a promise of coming back together after the army. So this is a really big deal, and they still remain hugely popular. If you look at the figures, while they were still together, it's estimated by one of the big research firms here that they were generating $3.5 billion US, the equivalent of a year for the Korean economy. Their soft power impact's enormous around the world. If you think of America at its heyday, Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, Coke, jazz and rock and roll. That's what BTS was doing for South Korea. It was making South Korea a household name, a brand in itself around the world. And I don't know if that figure even includes the tourism that it was bringing in here. So that they're huge, and they remain hugely influential. And I know for their fans, they're going to want them to reform after the army, and like Elvis when he joined the army, they'll no doubt be following each of the individual members as best as they can while they're actually serving in the military here, and it will go on. Now, whether they get back together again and whether they can maintain that popularity, that remains to be seen. But yeah, as you said, for the time being, it appears even though they're having this hiatus, their popularity hasn't waned at all.
Right, indeed. Meanwhile, Sebastien, Korean rapper Psy, he is currently in Paris, prepared to address the International Bureau of Expositions to promote Busan's chances of hosting the 2030 World Expo. That being said, what are your thoughts on Korea leveraging its soft power on the diplomatic stage?
Well, I mean, today is the big day for the Busan Expo build, since they have to present in front of the bureau, the International Bureau, their project. And of course, choosing Psy is an interesting signal, because Psy was like the symbol for the first time of an artist going global with his famous hit Gangnam Style. And so for international audience, it still represents a very powerful signal. So of course, Korea is trying to surf on this hallyu, on this attraction for its culture. It's trying to leverage its new soft power through the success of its artists, and that's going to be a key signal that be sent also by other members of the delegation, including President Yoon, who is going to present the bid today. But of course, they are facing also a huge challenge, because the people who are going to choose the next city for the expo are not necessarily the youngest one, and not necessarily the fan, the usual target group. There are going to be a lot of ambassadors there. It's going to be involving a lot of geopolitics, and Busan is facing a key opponent with Saudi Arabia and Riyadh, which has also playing its own type of soft power to influence capitals in Europe. So it's going to be a very challenging battle, I think, and in the next coming months we'll only see this competition eating up until the decision to be made in November.
Right, the decision will take place in November, as Sebastien just said. Jack, back on BTS. Suga, the member of BTS, he recently alluded to Beijing's unofficial K-pop ban. This was reported by the BBC. Could you tell us a bit about what he said? And what do you personally see for the future? Do you see a shift in this trend in the near future?
Well, this was during a live streaming event with fans, and asked on his solo tour would he be performing in China. And all he was really saying was something that everybody knows, but nobody's been wanting to say out loud, that K-pop artists can't play in China at the moment. They haven't been able to since 2016. And the reason they don't say it out loud is because there is always that hope that Beijing will lift this unofficial state of affairs, and that they will be allowed to it, and by speaking about it, it might make matters worse and therefore delay this whole process. But it came about because of the deployment of the THAAD anti-missile system here, the X-band radar that comes with it that can peer into China, the retaliation from China that it included some official retaliation, but a lot of unofficial retaliation that makes it very hard for Korea to say go to the World Trade Organization. And so when, say, Xi Jinping met with President Yoon, he said there is no ban on, Korean content in China, but it's very clear there is. The programs have been taken off television, performers can't perform there. And under Yoon, we've seen it's become, South Korea's veered towards the United States a little bit more. We've seen more tensions, inappropriate comments from China's ambassador, and we see these tensions getting worse. So I don't see this state of affairs changing in the near future. But to be fair to Yoon, under Moon Jae-in, who tried very hard for a softer approach with China, it didn't help either. So unfortunately what we have is this unofficial ban on South Korean content in place. It is a big deal because China was the biggest market for South Korean content, so we're talking millions if not billions of dollars here. It would be nice to see things change. It would be nice to see a more positive relationship again, but for the time being, unfortunately, I think we're going to see this in place for the next few years.
Right. Sebastien, back in Paris, along with his World Expo agenda, President Yoon Suk-yeol is also scheduled to sit down with French President Emmanuel Macron on Tuesday. What looked to top their talks?
Well, of course, they will talk about the expo, and President Yu will make a last push to convince France to at least be positive on Busan, since so far France has expressed its support for Saudi Arabia. But of course, some of the bilateral topic on the agenda, there will be North Korea. That's what South Korea is pushing for. France has always been supporting a kind of a tough stance on North Korea, especially when it comes to alleviating sanctions. France, as a nuclear state, wants to be extremely firm on so-called denuclearization, and so probably President Yoon will try to gain support from one of the members of the UN Security Council on that issue. But they're also going to look at cooperation. President Yoon wants to develop cooperation in the space industry. We know that South Korea is building up its space industry, its space program, and they are looking for some cooperation with Europe and with France in that respect, because France and Europe developing the so-called Ariane space rocket. And in return, France also interested in more like issue like semiconductor, high technology, economic security, and these topics have been hinted actually by President Yoon in a recent article where he called for stronger cooperation with France. So that will be on the agenda, and of course there will be a discussion also about the next step. President Macron is supposed to visit Korea sooner or later. This visit has been postponed several times, so I think the Koreans are also expecting that finally the French president makes pay a visit here later this year or next year. So that will be the main topic on the agenda. Not to mention also more geopolitical issues like Ukraine, and of course China, as we know that France also is kind of torn apart between the United States and China on this very highly sensitive issue.
Right. Well, French President Macron has been trying to balance ties with the US and China in recent times. Back here in Korea, Jack, also this past Saturday, the Daegu Queer Culture Festival made a bit of international headlines. Tell us about the coverage, and also, Jack, where do you suppose does Korea stand in terms of LGBTQ rights?
I really enjoyed reading that story. It was not often in the news that you read something that kind of puts you in a better mood after you've read it. There's so much negative news around. South Korea is a very conservative country, and you know, I'm not one to lecture anybody. I'm sort of a little bit against the Anglo-Saxon tendency to have this missionary zeal of saying you should think and behave exactly like, say, Western European countries, or each country is entitled to their own way and their own evolutionary process. But I think one great thing is you don't have to accept things, but you do have to be tolerant. That's a really nice fundamental principle. If we look at countries like Thailand or the Netherlands, which are deeply conservative countries, but they're very, very tolerant. So people might not want to be a part of those things themselves, but they're very tolerant of other people doing them. So we had this situation in Daegu where the officials and some church groups came out to try and block this festival going ahead. And we see this all around the world, and in many countries with the growing conservatism in many places, we see the police carting off the members of the LGBTQ community. And so I had to read the story a couple of times, like, hang on, who got carted away? It was the city councillors. And I thought it was wonderful, because there was a few question marks about whether they had the permits, but it was the police fundamentally saying everybody has a right to let their voice be heard. Now, the church groups have a right too, and the councillors. Everybody should have their right to have their opinion. And, you know, the LGBTQ community, of course, has to be tolerant of those opinions in the same way they have to be tolerant of that community. But I thought it was also a great story about the police. All around the world, so many negative police stories, even in my own country, Australia, of abuse and brutality. And what a nice story to see the police protecting the community, being cheered on by the community, and in this news story all around the world. Essentially, I was cheering on the police as well. I thought he might get into a bit of trouble from the local city council, but he'll be cheered on by many, many people around the world, the police chief down in
Right,
Daegu.
hopefully.
It was wonderful. Yeah, again, you know, tolerance, that's the key word. And for all the conservatism, it's good to see that tolerance trumps the day.
Right, tolerance. I'd have to agree with you there. And Sebastian, broadly speaking, do you believe Korea can afford to do more, perhaps, to better raise awareness about its marginalized groups?
Well, I mean, as Jack said, I mean, nobody has the right to lecture anyone, and I mean, everyone has to look from which history you start from. I mean, Korea in history is a very homogeneous society, still now today. So they are not. Korea is not used to a mix of culture like some other countries have experienced through their history. So we are at a stage where Korea is opening up. But of course, it's a challenging phase. We've seen also issue, for example, also in Daegu, there was an issue about a mosque where some Muslim student couldn't celebrate their religion because the local were opposing it. There are many cases like that. So I think Korea is actually opening up, but it's a very gradual step, and there's a lot of reluctance. And also behind this discussion, of course, there's the issue of immigration. It's like to what extent this society is open to get an influx of people and culture from outside the world. And we know that with the demographic crisis that Korea is facing now, this issue is going to be extremely relevant. And so beyond your question, there is this question of immigration. And also I would say that when we talk about Korean society, which Korean society we're talking about? Because also Korean society is going through a very spectacular generational gap. If you talk to a new generation in Korea, or if you talk to older generation in Korea, you might hear very different issue on this kind of different answer on this kind of sensitive issue. So also Korea is actually changing. Korean society is actually transforming itself, and I think new generation are more open to embrace some differences. But as Jack said, I totally agree with the. You can be conservative and be tolerant. That's the big challenges. But to do that, you first need to accept maybe a more diversity. So you also accept more influx of different kind of people also in the country.
Right. And beyond South Korea, moving up north, Jack, the plight of people in North Korea appears to be aggravated post-pandemic. Could you tell us a bit more about this unfortunate reality, and what are the implications of that reality on stability on the peninsula, do you think?
Yeah, of course, we don't know how bad the situation is in North Korea, because Kim Jong-un has closed the country off so successfully during the pandemic to the point where anyone who tries to cross the river was shot or tries to cross the border. So even the number of people escaping the country is really a trickle. Even though we do hear reports in the media that the situation is dire, and they may not be approaching the level of starvation that was experienced in the 90s when around 3 million people are estimated to have died, but it appears to be on that track where even people who are normally comfortable middle class citizens, people in Pyongyang, are now beginning to feel the pinch. Will that have an impact on the regime, on Kim Jong-un? That all depends on whether that has a real impact on roughly the 3 million people who run the system, on who Kim Jong-un depends. Now, if he can keep them happy, if he can keep them sort of well-fed and well-housed and comfortable, probably the regime is stable, even if, unfortunately, the rest of the country starves under the most awful conditions. But what we do hear is reports that it has undermined faith in his leadership, and that sounds crazy. We often think outside of North Korea, how can anybody have faith in his leadership? But of course, when you're in that system and the only information you're getting is in that system, that's all you have. That is your, apart from some smuggled CDs or DVDs, for which again now you can be shot for having. So yes, people, it does appear, bought into Kim Jong-un perhaps being able to bring more prosperity, but now it seems he's the most iron-fisted of the 3 members of his family who have ruled, and the conditions look to be more dire than ever. But again, it comes down to, will that affect the inner circle? If it affects the inner circle, absolutely, that could have real implications for the leadership. But if he can contain this so that it's just the ordinary people, unfortunately, who are suffering so badly, they will carry on the way they have carried on now for decades in dire circumstances.
Right. And talking about the people of the inner circle, Sebastien, a key political conference opened in North Korea this past weekend. What was shared about the agenda?
Well, I mean, this meeting is so the Workers' Party is currently holding a very special working gathering, and what has been so far the key item on the agenda is the failure, that's the name that have been used officially, of the launch of a satellite a couple of weeks ago that had even triggered alert in South Korea. And it's very interesting that it's very rare for the regime to acknowledge publicly such a failure. Clearly there is the leadership has been sending a signal that people need to be punished. So there is a rumor of purge ongoing in Pyongyang. It's still rumors, we don't know, but what is the significance of this meeting? Clearly the leadership want to send a message that he needs to find some scapegoats, he needs to find some new momentum, because this failure to launch this satellite is a setback for the leadership, for Kim Jong-un, because he has been developing his military build-up. He has made the launch a key milestone for this year. He has been announcing this since the beginning of this year, and now they are facing a major delay. And to make things worse, South Korea has successfully launched its own rocket, so it doesn't look good. So clearly there's a sense of urgency beyond the meeting that is ongoing. And the big question is, are we going to see a reshuffle leadership? Interestingly, we see a veteran like Kim Yong-chol, who had been sidelined for a couple of years after the Hanoi summit debacle. Suddenly he's coming back and seen in picture with the leadership, with the leader supreme Kim Jong-un. So clearly something is happening. The question is, as usual with North Korea, we don't know exactly what's happening. It's like a black box. But more broadly, you have the impression that, as Jack mentioned, the situation in North Korea is not smooth at all, and the leadership is under a lot of pressure. There's clearly some economic challenges since COVID that have been increased, and also the leadership needs to show that its strength, and this satellite, this military buildup was part of this narrative. So clearly we can smell around that meeting that things are not going as planned, and that the leadership needs to assert again its strength in a moment of relative weakness.
Right, which is why North Korea has pledged that a new satellite launch will take place in the very near future. Well, that is all the time we have for this edition. Sebastien, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Jack, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends Tuesday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Be sure to join us same time tomorrow.